So here we have on the Timb Tool Show, we got Controlled Opposition and CP Defender debating about how best to fleece the whites. Let's check it out.
So just happy to go through more.
Go for it, please.
Yeah,
no,
so
hit me.
I think this is actually really helpful. So how about reparations for slavery?
I think I'm pretty in favor of that, yeah.
Okay, make the argument.
It's just an owed debt. We said 40 acres and a mule. We never paid it. And unfortunately, the material reality for a lot of people who work.
Yeah, we did. We did Liberia. We did fucking trillions of dollars in the war on poverty with the whites. That's just disingenuous framing on multiple different sides. Charlie Kirk and those like him would probably agree with the premise that the welfare state is bad, though, because that they whinge endlessly about that. But this guy's disregarding, attempts with the welfare state to repair all that. It's a lie.
Or slaves didn't change that much after they were emancipated. I mean, if you were a slave and you're made free, that's a big step up, don't get me wrong, but you have nothing. I mean, nothing. And because of the way generational wealth transfers from father to son or mother to anyone to their children, caught me there. Unfortunately, we still see the consequences of that borne out. You can actually look county by county. This
guy's visually nauseating.
Which were the plantation counties. And you see, this group of black neighborhoods, that's where they settled after slavery ended. It's really immediate stuff, and it's a debt owed that this nation never paid.
Lies.
I don't necessarily agree on reparations, but I think we need to clarify what that ultimately means. But I will say,
take the beanie off, Tim.
I've held the same position. I actually worked on a documentary. There's an issue of people who were enslaved. Then they were released, and they were not given any means to actually develop and grow. And so there's a generational wealth gap between people based on race for these historical reasons. The challenge I see,
so what?
We've done a lot to amend the laws and change them. For instance, redlining and blockbusting have become illegal, and now we're dealing with an ultimately, I believe, is a class issue. Of course, racism still exists. But anyway, I digress.
No way.
What I wanted to get to is specifically on reparations.
These people are always going to operate under the framework of racism is real, and it's a clear and present specter or system that is very ill-defined, but it's just this vague idea that whites are around and that there's a white way of operating in society, and that it's problematic for other groups to adhere to a white way of a Eurocentric way of acting, so it's racist. So that's the premise that all three of these people, by the way, to varying degrees of severity, go along with this premise. So just keep that in mind.
What do you view reparations as, more importantly?
It's fleecing white people.
So this is a big divide. Some people think cash payments. I'm not a big fan of that. It doesn't fix the problem, for one. It's if you can put money into that community, but there's been research done on how long a dollar stays in a black neighborhood as opposed to a white neighborhood. And if a black neighborhood, all of the businesses are owned by corporate boards that are all majority white. Eventually, the money filters out, and you get a very temporary boost in living situation. Not much long-term structural change. I'm a big fan of structural reparations, not based on race, but rather based on targeting neighborhoods that need it the most. Some of these neighborhoods are white. I passed through some of them on my way out from Ronald Reagan Airport. I can tell which parts of this country. You can see it in the bones of the neighborhood. And I think that a new proper reparations project, a new deal even, would go a long way. Get some
so you're saying not
there.
even based on race?
I think that we should recognize that this is largely a racial project because, unfortunately, poverty and race are really intertwined in this country. But in terms of applying it, I think that it would be much more healthy if we treated it like a collective effort to bring up the lowest sort of echelon of our economic.
Interesting. So Vaush is actually not even explicitly. That's kind of interesting. Oh, whoops. Drop something here. No, it's interesting. So he would kind of include whites. From what I heard from others, Vaush was the only one to throw the whites a bone. And even at some point, I heard that he throws the MRAs a bone during this talk. But maybe we'll get into that. We might find that in a second. But that's actually surprising.
I want to ask you, Charlie, would you agree with a program that was in
economic reparations
how do I describe this?
That would be racialized mostly,
but was not based on race, went to people based on class and neighborhood, so that it could help Latinos and white people and Asians and everybody?
First of all, I'm against reparations. I just don't like the word because it kind of implies this intergenerational type guilt or allowance that I kind of reject, and I'm happy to build that out further. Do I agree that the question is mostly class? Oh, absolutely. And I think that Vaush is hitting on something, and I think that you're saying that it's inherently racial. I really want to explore that with you because I think that's interesting. I think you're wrong, but I think that's interesting, where I think the racial thing is actually being used to distract people like you and I from actually talking about what's really happening here, which is a small group of people getting a lot richer while normal people get poor.
Who's that small group of people, Charlie?
Being used as this distraction tool to throw smokescreen in the middle, while we're talking about something that we're never really going to have consensus on, when the true struggle right now is mainly economic.
It's mostly attacking white middle-class people, though.
Applying reparations along racial lines runs into a bunch of really tough issues. Which neighborhoods? Do you go by, like, blood? Like, can you prove your great-great-grandfather was a slave? It gets very difficult.
Interesting. Wow,
maybe that would be the most direct interpretation of generational reparations. But in my mind, the reason why it's important to recognize the racial issue here is that the nature of class divides in this country is cut into racial policy prior to the Civil Rights Act. The redlining that took place, lines which still remain not in law but in practice,
they
led
don't.
to very distinct. I mean, sometimes one side of the highway is nice and the other side.
See, Vaush is the kind of guy who'd be like, "Oh yeah, there's violent crime over here." Well, because redlining, it's just like redlining, systemic systems of redlining, structural, socioeconomic. They have a whole magic bag of buzzwords. Like, let's see how many he can pull out.
Side of the highway. I mean, a legitimate
highways. Freeways. Freeways cause
47th Street was split by race. No joke. This is long-standing effects on the city. Just to point out.
So what?
No, and I grew up in LA, and on either side of the 5, which cut through the city. I mean, or the 405. Sorry.
Let me.
Right. Yeah. They're moving away from all the crime.
We were actually told that we would be arrested.
So yeah, these people are accepting the framework that it is so-called racist for white people to move away from violent, dysfunctional demographics and disparate factions that have difficulty assimilating into the broader culture of whiteness. Like, for instance, not wearing a beanie indoors when you're like a 35 or whatever 40-year-old man.
From the south side of
That's one
47th,
example.
We crossed 47th. We would get arrested because the cops would pull up and say, "You don't live in this neighborhood. What are you doing here?"
I'm from the suburbs.
Not
of
true,
Chicago,
but
so I've heard stories like that. I'm
No,
very clear to say I'm not from Chicago.
I grew up in Beverly Hills, which is close though to West Hollywood and Koreatown, and the lines are clear as day. The reason I say that though about like the racial project is that because explicit discrimination is no longer in the law. We've pretty much wiped that out, with the exception of some, I guess, edge cases. The project of systemic racism, or the existence of systemic racism, is something which is carried through class by inertia. It isn't something you can explicitly legislate along anymore. I mean, obviously,
this is crystal rubbing, hippy dippy, woo woo bullshit.
That'd be silly.
People believe this shit.
The consequences of slavery and of second-class
inertia
people left unaddressed, a wound left to fester that unfortunately can't really heal itself inertially unless we do something specific.
So the issue with that argument is that
he said do something specific, but he didn't name anything specific. It's just this vague idea that whites have to give more resources to blacks. He says that it's not about money because it doesn't solve the problem, but it's like, what does that mean? It just means that not enough money has been dispensed yet. That's pretty much not enough resources, not enough labor, not enough death and sacrifice of white people. That's probably what it means.
More that we intervened in the black community, it actually had the opposite effect.
Whatever.
And Thomas Sowell probably has done the best research and literature on this. You can laugh all you want. He's got a lot of credentials.
I wasn't trying to besmirch.
He's a very thoughtful thinker, and he actually lived through this, right? He lived through the black renaissance in the 40s and the 50s, where redlining was a legitimate problem. So was yellow lining, by the way, against Italians and against Jews. Nowhere nearly as bad, but there were other degrees of discrimination based on ethnicity and cultural background.
It was actually worse against the whites and Latinos,
especially the area really well.
Magically,
Chicago,
they bounced back
right near the Chicago stockyards. The black community almost had this rallying cry where they were being discriminated against everywhere, and they kind of collectivized their purchasing power, and they saw their incomes increase actually at a higher rate than white Americans in the 40s and 50s and early 60s. You've heard this argument many times, and you probably disagree with it, but it's just true is that the moment that we all of a sudden de-emphasized fathers being in the home and subsidized fatherlessness, we saw all these other trends increase. So in the right before the Civil Rights Act passed, about 24% of black children were born without a father. Now it's upwards of 70%. You guys can look at the Washington Examiner. It's 77%. Let's say it's 65%. So something has to explain that 40-point increase.
May I?
Yeah, just let me finish.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily that America got more racist. It could be the cocaine thing, which, is a common issue. It could be, operations of all these things. But a 40-point increase, I would point to a culture of fatherlessness, really bad government-run public schools, and then subsidizing behavior that isn't good.
Who's running all that? Who's voting for all of that in these areas? And who's elected? I mean, all of that is just euphemism for the people themselves, right? And the culture and history of them themselves, right? And that's what's left unaddressed. And the framing here is, again, like racist whites' responsibility is to come forward and be the white saviors, as they deny it up and down. They'll deny it, yeah. No, we're not doing white saviorism, but this is a panel of white saviors, heads of the Save the Blacks Foundation.
So
that's ultimately what this is, and it's anti-white.
I can agree with you on. First of all, having two people in your house to raise you is pretty much essential.
Mom
you
and
absolutely
father.
Glad we
need to.
agree.
This is undeniable. While I don't believe in shaming single parents, even if their single parentedness is a product of bad decision making.
Also, by the way, isn't the rate amongst the white community, like, it's pretty high as well? But again, whites are not going around ganging up and drive-bying and crack slanging as much, except for the odd, like, exploding meth lab or what have you, which, hopefully nobody's writing, like, heavy metal songs glorifying that. I don't think that's a trend in the white community, right? It's just, like, it's never the same. These motherfuckers want to treat every disparity as if it's waithism, because they're treating it as if it's one big egalitarian fantasy land where all groups are the same, right? They all start from that premise, and they all start from the premise that any disparity brought upon is due to white racism, and it's whites' responsibility to pay for, in Charlie Kirk's case, it's probably pay for, like, school vouchers. In Vaush's case, it's like pay for, like, a youth center for the black kiddies to play at, and they're not attending the youth center. Well, it must also, because of racism, give them more money, more teachers, more this, more that. And then everybody moves out of the cities, and they become crack and crime infested shitholes with rent skyrocketing, and it's just, it sucks.
Making it still good. You need, it's in this economy, one parent, honestly.
Yeah.
But with that being said, there has been research shown that the rate of black fatherlessness is somewhat over-exaggerated, in large part because that number only applies to married fathers, so husbands raising their children. It turns out when you account for unmarried black couples taking care of their kids, the numbers actually rise to those just below white couples. I think there was an article on that. I don't know if I saw it in Vice, but it tracks back to some really big study that was done back in 2016. So that's one point. But
it's ridiculous.
There are
who buys that?
For example, many welfare stipulations cut off with a shared income, which is only a few $1,000s per year higher than the necessary cutoff for the single income. Meaning that if you're a single mom, you can apply for the welfare just fine. But then if you get married or otherwise file jointly, you go above the cap for welfare. This is a horribly designed program, undeniably, and it incentivizes bad, destructive behavior. The best thing that we can do, we restructure
the welfare
by
design, Vaush?
Welfare is good for us. It is. I don't benefit from it. No, I don't think either of you benefit from it, I'm guessing. But we do collectively downstream from the increased economic potential of people who now have the money to afford daycare, proper childcare, get an education. In the long run, people in this country...
There's cultural differences, Vaush.
It's a mutual project. So we work on that. We find out what works and what doesn't.
There's cultural differences between the way different demographics interact with the safety net, that kind of make it a little bit incoherent and contradictory and dissonant. Do you think bourgeois, like Beverly Hills mofos like this, or Chicago suburb mofos like Charlie Kirk understand this? Or even Tim Pool with his grug-brained grifter self? I mean, Do you think they understand that? Do you think they want to understand that? Let me check my audio here. Okay, cool.
Which welfare programs function, which don't, which types of economic revitalization function and which don't. And I legitimately believe that if we apply this country has the bones to be just a permanent economic beacon on the hill, just like a shining example to the rest of the world.
I agree with a lot of that. The bigger issue with the racial thing is that when you put some of these factors in even to present data, it doesn't pan out on racial lines, right? And this is where I think you'll agree, because you just said 2 parents in the home is a good thing, which we totally agree on. I think that's the ideal. Everything shows that is something that we should push for.
3 parents, maybe. Getting even better.
Oh, yeah. 50%. Yeah, polyamorous relationships.
Yeah.
Not a fan.
Based.
But I will say that if you look at the data from the government, that a white child being raised by a single mother is less likely to succeed by 10 independently picked metrics than a black child being raised by a mother and a father. And so maybe it's less about the skin color and more about the removal of parents and specifically fathers in the homes.
But there's
now,
tendencies,
if you want to talk
Charlie.
about the domestic Marshall Plan to go put fathers back in the home regardless of skin color, I will sign up for that in a second.
With the right welfare, the right systems, I think people will tend to their own families.
But that would then all of a sudden de-emphasize what you said earlier, where it says it needs to be on racial lines. Where I say, no, it needs to be on nuclear family lines.
Well, no, I think that the neighborhood revitalization should just be on like a sort of class assessment. I think that when we recognize this problem, though, there are so many trends when it comes to poverty that involve the discussion of race, you know? And there are some which do not. There are some types of poverty, some effects that are just ubiquitous and equally felt. But with regards to, say, black people, the fact that they couldn't get loans to purchase homes for a very long time. I mean, there were people living who couldn't do this. The fact that they didn't benefit from the Marshall Plan, if I remember correctly, after World War II.
Well, Marshall Plan was Europe. You're talking about the GI Bill.
They get subsidies now.
Let me just
this guy's
point out all
fucking
these white guys
uninformed.
have a debate over the black community, huh?
I just think that there is a lot of.
What did he just fucking call
GI Bill?
Oh, sorry, the GI Bill. My apologies.
Let me just point out all these white guys sitting having a debate over the black community, huh?
I just think that there is a lot of economic inequality. A lot of it's tied to race, but we don't need to turn this into some weird blood quantum issue where we go tracking down every black American and holding them under a microscope to see whether they get benefits. We just need to tend to our own.
Thanks for checking out this clip.
Okay, well, that was almost based on the part of Vaush, although I don't know what the hell, that was out of left field. Like, he's treating it like mostly colorblind, but also saying we have to look at it through a racial lens. Kind of odd. Charlie Cook is just that. They're basically just, I don't know, they're incoherent, trying to corral people away from noticing race. That's probably the ultimate gay op, so don't regard these child molesters for even a second.